Welcome, everyone, to the third ever episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. My name is Clay Graubard, and I am joined with my co-host, Andrew Eady. In the Global Guessing Weekly podcast, we talk about all things forecasting and geopolitics. In this week's episode, we are without a guest, and so in this week's episode, we will be talking about a new prediction website that we came across that is interesting for more than just its method, as well as the recent geopolitical news that has happened in the United States and across the world. But in this episode, we want to start off dealing with a controversy relatively close to home. This week on his blog, Astral Codex 10, Scott Alexander, formerly the blog writer of Slate Star Codex, wrote about a Metaculus scoring controversy, which was pointed out recently and is something that we ourselves have noticed. And the root of this problem is that there is this website called Metaculus that we are a part of, that we make forecasts on, that attempts to use the community to forecast events happening in the future. And the way in which it incentivizes forecasts is by providing points to individuals to make more accurate forecasts. And the purpose of its scoring system is, in theory, to reward people that make the most accurate forecasts. But what has been pointed out in these blog posts that we've been reading and that we've noticed ourselves is that many a times you can make points by simply arbitraging the question. For instance, if the community thinks there's a 50% chance of an event happening, sometimes if you say guessed 52%, you would gain points whether you were right or you were wrong. And in other cases, it's been found that if you just always guess what the community thinks, you will always make points on the platform. And so what many people are pointing out is that this is not actually incentivizing proper forecasting, and that the system can be abused by people sort of spamming either the community prediction or these sort of arbitrage points where you go a little bit to the left or the right of the community median and get points no matter how events turn out. And that in turn creates two downsides. Number one, a lot of people are just going to go on Metaculus and sort of take the easy way out on predictions. Something that Andrew and I have noticed is when making forecasts, they can take a lot of time. But finding a point on a scale where you can gain points one way or another is a pretty easy thing to do. And so if you get stumped on a prediction, instead of sort of muscling it out, you can just make that sort of guess. The other issue is that it really sort of distorts what the community prediction is. It creates a lot of weight around the median if people are incentivized just to sort of stick with how the community says. So for instance, let's say the community thinks right now there's a 50% chance an event happens, and there's 20 people forecasting that. And now 100 more people come there, and a certain majority don't want to go through and make a difficult forecast. If they just keep spamming that 50%, as time goes on, more and more people are going to think, wow, the community is really sure about this. I don't feel confident enough to really stick out outside of the median. And so there's going to be sort of a more pull towards this artificially confident median forecast. And this is something that at least I think is a pretty big issue. And Andrew, what do you think about this sort of Metaculus problem? I know some people are thinking that it's sort of overblown and that, people are going to make good forecasts because they want to make good forecasts, and that, points on Metaculus don't matter. But some people are sort of raising the flag that they can make a better scoring system that incentivizes good forecasts rather than good pointmanship.
Well, listen, we've talked about how forecasting is a very new sort of presence in the mainstream, and you see a lot of platforms like the Forecast app launched by Facebook, like Metaculus, like Rootclaim, which we'll get to, who are all experimenting with different scoring structures and different incentive structures for the forecasters. And I think we haven't really reached a perfect system yet, which is why people are testing out so many different things, because it is tricky. And it's interesting if you want to go back to, the Balk and Devlin podcast that we had, our first one, and he talked a lot about incentive structures. And we asked him about some of these forecasting platforms, and he shared with us that he's also sort of skeptical about, forecasters prioritizing ranking up in the leaderboards and getting points versus being a good forecaster and, giving accurate predictions. I think something that we read on one of these blogs, rossery.net, he says that, you know, the percentage that somebody gives on Metaculus for a forecast should not be sort of the first order piece of data that you're using to then look at the community. It should be an input into some sort of aggregators that you can more, so you can sort of get rid of that arbitrage that you're talking about with points. It seems like the Metaculus leadership is aware of these issues. I think they've responded to them. And it seems like they support their original rationale for structuring the incentives on Metaculus as they have. But I think, as you said, it is definitely, a very relevant issue to us even. We do Metaculus Mondays. We were predicting on Metaculus all the time. And so as we're looking, to put a percentage down, sometimes it can be hard not to just at least notice the fact that, we could make this forecast and, hedge both ways and make it better for the global guessing Metaculus account. So, I think there's a long way to go in terms of figuring out the best way to structure these platforms. But I think this discussion in itself, sort of from a meta perspective, is really beneficial.
Healthy. Yeah, it's really healthy.
Exactly, because I think it's the only way we get there.
And there's so many different ways that you can score predictions. I came across a blog post from Zivi, who Scott Alexander had sort of used as the sort of catalyst for his blog post. Zivi is a blogger who, at least recently, is known for doing sort of weekly recaps on Less Wrong about COVID. But back in April of 2020, he created a very long blog post about evaluating predictions in hindsight. And he presented 8 different methods for evaluating forecasts, which to me was a lot more than I had ever seen. Before this, I had seen the Metaculus system, which is this mixture of you are betting against the Metaculus house, and you're also betting against the community. So how Metaculus points work on a very, very simplistic basis is when you make a prediction, you're actually making 2 bets. You're making one bet against the house, where on average you are going to lose points. The expected value is negative. And the other one is against the community, where your expected value is positive. And it sort of takes a combination of those 2 and gives you overall points. The other one that we know is from Philip Tetlock's super forecasting, which is this idea of a Breyer score, which is really trying to say, how accurate are you? If you say something is going to happen, if I say there's a 50% chance that a war is going to break out tomorrow, and a 50% chance that a president will resign in 2 weeks, if you take enough of those predictions, 50% of them should happen and 50% of them shouldn't happen. If you say something 60%, 60% should happen. You're supposed to be well calibrated with your prediction. And that's the one that the Good Judgment Project and a lot of the IARPA tournaments use to assess how good a forecast is. And for some reason in these prediction markets, this idea of using a Breyer score is considered not good enough. And I'm not entirely well read enough to understand why, but I think part of it has to do with not all questions are made equally. And if you're in this sort of governance, for those of you who don't know, IARPA is intelligence funded research in essence. If you know what DARPA is, which is defense is the DoD funding research, IARPA is the intelligence community funding research. And so the intelligence community has funded these forecasting tournaments. But when you run your own forecasting tournament, you can sort of set all the questions. And so presumably all questions are more or less made equal, right? In Tetlock's forecasting, he says they normally spend a relatively even band of time on each question. But we've gone to Metaculus. Our JCPOA forecast took us 4 hours, 5 hours, maybe. Whereas our forecast on Starlink, albeit, made to be a little bit were entirely funny, took us less time to do. And because people that are asking community questions ask questions from such a wide range of topics with different levels of rigor into the writing of the question itself, that you can't sort of score all things the same, I think is what the community says. And so it's how do you sort of score the difficulty of a question when a centralized committee is not creating the questions? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, also when you're looking at, an array of incentive structures as well, it's going to be hard to score all questions equally because even just the way that you approach the questions or the incentive that you have to forecast certain percentages and make certain predictions is going to be, potentially vastly different across the platform. So I think, yeah, having a broader score across all of these different forecasting platforms is definitely difficult.
And but then how do you have any like how when community is asking questions, do you sort of say this was a hard question or not, right? One could be like you don't sort of get points. You don't know how many points you're going to get necessarily until the question resolves and until like the score is settled. And so if maybe you do it based on how the Metaculus community aggregate has done, and then you use that as some sort of baseline of difficulty. Maybe you do what percentage of people that forecasted the question got it wrong. But then how do you deal with like people say like spamming wrong predictions in a way to make a question seem artificially difficult? Um,
I was going to say, yeah, my instinct was to say you could try and take it the same way that in school, you grade tests on a curve, and that sort of gives you a sense for how difficult the test was based on people's performance, and then you sort of skew the results down proportionately. But as you said, in a test, you have a set number of people in the class. You don't have people that can repeatedly take the test a bunch and do really poorly, so that it seems like the test was way harder than it actually is. So I mean, I think theoretically there are some models uh, to try and combat that, but in practice, it's probably a lot more difficult. So I definitely don't envy where a lot of these platforms are right now, because they're facing down a monumental path.
here's a here's a thought I just had, so it's probably not going to be great, but let me know what you think. Um, So we have this idea of super forecasters. For those of you who don't know, super forecasters are people who, when forecasting, just consistently do better than the average forecaster does. Consistently much better, like orders of magnitude better in terms of their foresight capabilities. And that's the sort of premise. So maybe Metaculus, as time goes on, they sort of identify a cluster of people who are consistently considered good forecasters. And maybe they even like run a tournament trying to select those people for a year. And those people are kind of considered like the basket of goods that is used to sort of measure question difficulty. I mean, the hard part of that is it's a community platform. Anyone can submit questions. You would probably need a lot of people because you're going to need a lot of forecasts on each one of them. You couldn't rely on a baseline of just one. So maybe like that's the clear limitation that I've already identified. But something like that, maybe where you're using like your best forecasters in some way to get, post facto, like the difficulty of a question.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. Using, maybe partnering with the Good Judgment Project, um, getting super forecasters to sort of set a benchmark for some of these questions, or maybe set a benchmark for a certain type of question. Again, like you said, the limitation is probably just bandwidth and volume of questions. But there's got to be a way. Maybe Good Judgment Project has some sort of automated forecasting capabilities, or they have some way to sort of keep up with the volume. But I think that is maybe the best fix that I can think of is having super forecasters set a benchmark, because otherwise, like you said, yeah, or even some of the top forecasters from Metaculus. But then that gets difficult because how are they the top forecasters based on points? And we just talked about how controversial the point system is. So it might have to be these super forecasters vetted.
You cut out, Andrew. Can you?
Oh, sorry, I think I just hit the mute button.
Ah,
Um, yeah, but yeah, what I was saying is that the only option might be to have people who have been vetted by a non-point based incentive forecasting environment, like super forecasters.
or they maybe treat like points in like a certain way. I know like one of the issues they said is you could just sort of um, like spam at like towards like the end of the prediction or result. So maybe it's like the time between forecast to points, or like how many points you have like per forecast. Like if, like say someone that has 100 points, but got them over 100 forecasts, just sort of arbitraging and getting 1 point is not as good of a forecaster who got their 100 points by making 10 forecasts that was able to sort of, get their points by clearly seeing their smaller set of problems better. I know that the Metaculus community in their blog post had mentioned that they're trying to strike this balance between breadth and depth of forecast. But at least according to these blogs, it seems as of right now, it's tilted too much over towards breadth rather than depth, and maybe something where you judge how many forecasts it took to get points could help out, or maybe that's just like way off, and someone's going to be like, well, actually, that opens up a whole wrong can of worms where you're just trying to hunt for a question early on where people are really wrong. Like if there's 20 forecasts and it just happened to all the dumb people happen to have forecasted it earlier, then you could just walk in and just scoop up points, and then the system would be like, oh, you're actually a genius. So, I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts on this Metaculus scoring controversy? I know it's something that I think we should keep thinking about because how you score forecasts is big to us as well.
Yeah, it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and we're not going to solve it on this podcast. There's a lot more qualified people who I'm sure
and there's math formulas involved too. So,
but do you know if you're incentivized to forecast earlier on Metaculus?
You are.
A function?
Yeah. Okay. So the earlier you forecast, the more points you get, and if you update more often, you also end up getting more forecasts.
I think that incentivizes good forecasting behavior.
Yeah, and
which is good.
Speaking of updating forecasts, a little change of plan, but let's talk about this week in geopolitics.
Yeah.
Starting off with, because it has to do with updating forecasts, the JCPOA. So it's come out recently, not sort of major news, but that the pace of talks for dealing with the JCPOA is slowing down, and that there is sort of increasing concern that there's no rush, especially on the Iranian side, to strike a deal right away, and that the constraints of the election are really starting to kick up. And as we had pointed out in our initial forecast, this month, the last month, and the month after are the most critical for a JCPOA deal happening in 2021. And so I thought it would be useful for us, to look back at our Metaculus forecast and think, was it correct where we left it, or should we update it a little bit? And Andrew, I was just wondering if you could just sort of talk a little bit more about the news while I get that set up.
Yeah, some of the biggest news, there was an obstacle, earlier in the month where the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, was trying to basically have talks go and inspect Iran's like uranium production and nuclear facilities. Iran was not having it. That was a big roadblock, because obviously that would be a prerequisite to any further negotiations between Iran and the U.S. regarding potential agreement, potential deal. Now that roadblock is passed, but I think it speaks to our initial thesis that a lot has changed between when the deal was first struck and now. There's a lot more talks that need to happen, a lot more auditing. And so
that just takes time, right?
Exactly. And so going back to our time constraints, it's likely to happen. A deal is likely to happen at some point. It seems like both parties have incentive to join, but steps actually getting a deal done this year, it just doesn't look very likely. So I think our directionally, our outlook was correct from the outset. I think, since we made the prediction, we've been less and less confident that this deal is going to get done this year. And I think, the news from this week, the fact that now they're just starting to have talk with the IAEA, they're going to go to Iran and, look at their facilities and look at the production. I think it only strengthens our thesis.
And I think the other big piece of news that I just found up again is that Iran had rejected to have European-U.S. talks, and that Iran was quite pissed that the U.S. and the EU were going to not sanction. Censure them for some of their recent activities in the region. And so we had originally said, I pulled up the forecast here, that it is a 20% chance that the U.S. rejoins the Iran deal before 2022. And if you are watching this in video format, what you can see here on Metaculus is when this question first opened up, it was low at 40%, and then it dipped and sort of stayed at 60%. And then when we answered the question, it was at 55%.
Is this meant to be up on the screen?
Yeah, it is on the screen right now. And it's actually sort of ticked up. But if you notice here on this graph, this gray chart is showing the confidence interval of this median prediction. And so it's showing that while on average people, and this actually goes back to the scoring thing, right? This median prediction is staying really stable, but it's actually dipping down quite a bit within, I believe this is the 25 to 75% confidence interval. I'm not entirely sure, but what you can see here is that in general, people are being relatively negative to the median, even though the median prediction is staying still at 55. And so the question for us is, do we feel that 20% is still the correct amount, right? We've talked about these number of negative impacts to happening in. And so do we still think there's a 1 in 5 chance that the US rejoins the Iran deal before 2022? And if not, what does that realistically fall to? Does that fall to 10%, which is then, a 1 in 10 chance, which is pretty rare? Is it even lower than that, right? In some degrees, maybe we're being too conservative. 1 in 5 seems like a low chance, but 1 in 5 things happen nearly all the time in life, relatively without.
They happen 1 out of 5 times.
Yes. Like, for instance, what's the equivalent of 1 in 5? I mean, if you have 3 children of the same sex, that's lower than a 1 in 5 chance of happening. And you see families like that all the time. Is the Iran deal more or less likely than a family having 3 children of the same sex at this point? That's one way to view it right now.
Yeah, no, I think it's good to have those sort of heuristics or just, ways to think about things, put it in perspective. I think our percentage definitely dropped from the news this week. I mean, especially also taking into account all the discussion about the stimulus bill and just the fact that there are so many other things on Biden's plate right now besides this Iran negotiation. I think it definitely drops. How much it drops is a question.
I didn't even think about the political constraints, but that's definitely a thing, right? If the interesting thing about the stimulus passage is not only, right, that Senate and congressional Republicans have been against it, which would indicate that any sort of congressional review of rejoining the JCPOA is not going to be a smooth passage, but that also that conservative Democrats, and particularly in the Senate, Joe Manchin, was willing to sort of obstruct the passage of the relief bill for 10 hours for relatively minor concessions. And, as Politico reported, so, it's a news report, take it with whatever confidence you want to give to that Democrats were concerned that Joe Manchin would actually side and support the Republican amendment on unemployment benefits for COVID, which indicates that really the Senate is really like kind of 50-50, and that people are really, they're going to be a lot of power players. So maybe the political constraints for Biden were greater than we had considered as well. And so I definitely, that's a good point. And I think the news this week is less new revelations and more sort of confirming a lot of the previous things that we had thought were possible, but not necessarily definitive in terms of negative factors on our probability. So I would feel at least comfortable dropping it by another 5%, which is quite a lot in terms of overall probability. The drop from 20 to 15.
I was going to have it somewhere in the 15 to 20 range, I think, as well, because I can also see political sort of constraints going the other way, and that I don't think the stimulus bill was a huge W for the Democrats, just because, the eligibility of who can get these bills is narrowed, and I don't think Biden's, at least the left side of his camp, is too thrilled about that. So I think that there is pressure from progressives to do something, I think, that aligns more with that wing of the Democratic Party, with that sort of very left wing of the Democratic Party. I think that can look like rejoining the deal. again, the time constraints, I think in this case outweigh the political constraints. And even if, he has a preference to rejoin the deal based on what his party's saying, it still might not be likely. However, I think that's why I wouldn't drop it too much, but I think somewhere in that 15 to 20%, maybe calling it even at 16 or 17, is probably appropriate at this time.
Yeah, I would say then we should drop it to, let's say, 15. Let's do it to 15 and then maybe revisit this with more time and sort of really write down the exact path of our logic in a Metaculus update. So on the news of this week, to the JCPOA, we are now forecasting the U.S. rejoins the Iran deal before 2022 is at 15% rather than 20%.
And I'm sure it'll get even lower as well.
As
more news comes out, but I think just
and also as time goes on, right? Naturally,
chances get lower and lower.
Yeah, because sort of the time for a last minute turnaround for secretly there have been back channel talks the whole time. The odds of that coming out just go down as time goes on. Although it would be hilarious if December 30th, Biden's like, surprise, we've been doing back channel talks this whole time. We've rejoined. and then our prior score would be really bad at that point. No, it would make
for Biden to keep those talks.
Biden though could be following global guessing and thought, how do we ruin their ability to forecast? No one thinks about that constraint.
He's using Iran to sabotage
global guessing
forecasting website. I see.
Exactly. Okay. I think I give my confidence behind that hypothesis at least 0.5%.
At least 0.5%. I was gonna exaggerate it wildly. Got it. But yeah, no, obviously that's going to be a big story in geopolitics.
The Biden global guessing controversy. Oh, you mean JCPOA?
Yeah. Over the course of this year and over the course of his term, I think, the Iran question, they are sort of this omnipresent, I say quote unquote threat because, my sort of outlook on Iran, on China, I think a lot of this is a product of asymmetry of information, security dilemma, but it still is obviously a big.
And the fact that every U.S. opponent is always considered a madman.
Yes.
We have this phenomenal capacity that we somehow always get faced up against madmen. That is the one truth in U.S. foreign policy. Right? Yep, always madmen. It's never like always this is a capable leader that is posed as madmen.
Well, they're only capable when we put them into power. when they're elected by their own people, then we got an issue. Anyway, let's move on to the next topic in geopolitics. A big story, again, maybe even bigger than JCPOA right now that's going on in the world. Is what's going on in Myanmar, which we talked about yesterday, which has been really interesting. Myanmar for a long time, for decades has been this quasi-democratic state where the military has had a lot of power, but there's been ebbs and flows of military control and democratically elected leaders. And most recently in February, the military carried out a coup, arresting the leader of Myanmar and taking control of the country. We talked about them shutting down the internet. People are taking out a lot of money from ATMs and going to grocery stores, sort of par for the course for those who have experienced this before. And on top of the Rohingya crisis that happened or has been happening for the last few years, there's a lot going on in Myanmar, and so not a formal forecast, but it'll be interesting to see how the U.S. responds and just what the future for Myanmar in that region of the world is.
Yeah, I think, we talked about this privately, but how likely was this event to happen in retrospect, I think is one way of thinking on the sort of way out of it too, right? If this was something that no one in retrospect could have seen coming, then I think the ability to forecast the outcome has a lot more sort of variance into it, at least as of right now, as a lot of things are still unfolding. On the other hand, in Myanmar, for those of you who are not aware of the constitutional framework or setup of Myanmar is that during the reforms that started in 2011 through 2015, where Myanmar transitioned to this quasi-democracy, the military they wrote the constitution, which allowed for quite a few things. Number one, the military was never under civilian control, so the military was under the control of the head general in the military. That's one thing. Number two, the Constitution was supposed to guarantee them at least 25 seats in the parliament. And number three, most importantly, is that the military, for any reason, or for national security that could threaten the integrity of the Union, could declare martial law and take over for at least a year, which is the pretext that they used in this coup. And the reason why they did the coup is because they got destroyed in the elections. I think there's, say, 430 seats in the Myanmar parliament. I think it's right around that number. The Democratic Party won something like 397 of those seats, and the military won 30, which is an absolute shellacking electorally. And I think maybe a realist would probably say that if you are in power, because how they also wrote the Constitution is that they were guaranteed certain ministries, I believe, that were particularly important, including foreign affairs. And so if you have this sort of grip on power, and you just got absolutely wiped out of it, and you have this sort of fail-safe where you can just sort of, say, oops, we're in power, it's probably more likely to have happened than I think people were anticipating. Like between the election results and when the coup happened, that people probably should have been a little bit more on alert, and maybe they were, and we just weren't attuned to it. And so if this is something that was likely to happen, then the resolution of it and when that resolution would happen is probably going to be further down the line, that this Myanmar crisis is not something that will get resolved within, say, like a month or two. And if we look at something like Thailand, which different, of course, but those protests have been going on for at least a year. And I don't know what the base rate is in terms of military coups and protests and how long those take to resolve. But, Lukashenko is still in power after the protests and after all these months. And so it doesn't look like there's sort of quick resolutions on this. And so I think, as unfortunate as it is to say, is that I don't see an easy way out of this. And if the military has been willing and is using deadly force against protesters, I would say it's more likely than not that, the coup stands at least 6 months out, I would say. Just thinking off the top of my head. I don't know what your thinking is, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that, this was somewhat predictable in the sense that, if the military felt threatened in terms of their influence in the country, then that they would definitely take this sort of action. And just looking at election results, it's kind of cool because we forecasted a lot of election results in the past. This led to sort of pretty directly this military coup. I do think, we talked about China's role in all of this, and the fact that China has invested, what do we say, $100 billion in different, infrastructure projects in Myanmar, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I do think, as we're seeing all of the ingredients for what could be, just a really bad time for Myanmar. I mean, I'm thinking about the Arab Spring, right? I mean, how did it start? It was a lot of peaceful protests met with, violence from the state, that led to much larger protests, domino effect. I'm not saying it's going to be that large, but I think when you see these seeds of, rampant instability, and China has this massive investment, my feeling is that either they're going to do something in the near term to try and just mitigate this from getting out of control, or, like you said, this is going to be a much longer issue. So I think it's like one of two things. It's either China, I don't even know what they would do, honestly, because looking at, how they treated the situation in Hong Kong, it seems like they have an appetite for, protesters being brutalized and just sort of letting that happen.
And,
but they also... Yes, and I mean, also, like, the Uyghur camp, like, China is not a purveyor of human rights around the world. Like, they would
neither
not.
would be, but
The U.S. is definitely not either. But I'm just saying that China would not step in from
On
a
a human rights
perspective.
basis, yeah.
But from an economic basis, I could see them, especially as, we talked about also this article where they set a growth target of 6% for 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we both read in Geopolitical Alpha, I know it seems like we talk about that every podcast, but that China during COVID was pretty stingy when it came to stimulus. It seems like they have these economic goals, whether it's to protect their middle class or whatever it is, just to grow as a power in the region, gain influence. Perhaps that's enough of an incentive for them to do something in Myanmar, at least to stop it from getting out of control. But if that doesn't happen in the near term, yeah, I think it's going to be a much longer term issue, especially as we said, it's been going on for decades in Myanmar.
I think the big thing for the Myanmar constraint for China, which I'd read about this morning, is that there's apparently a pretty key energy pipeline that goes right through Myanmar into China, because China is currently seeing soaring rises of energy consumption, in part due to how much they produce, but also right they're continually lifting people out of poverty. And as you get out of poverty and start industrializing rural areas, energy consumption goes up, obviously, and they have so many people. The question, though, is what is, for China, the most stable resolution of this? Because if you think about what would make Myanmar stable post-coup would almost be a complete eradication of the current constitutional system in Myanmar, right? You can't have the military be under its own control. You can't guarantee it 25% seats. There's a lot of things
markets
that
shut down when the military came into power. That's awful for China's investment. You're not going to get any foreign direct investment in Myanmar.
Well, they shut down the market so they could keep all the capital within the country, right? You don't want people selling off and putting their money into foreign markets. So the question, though, is in terms of that's a short-term shock. What is the complete reconfiguration and all the steps needed, right? It's not like the Myanmar military is going to be like, okay, we'll leave power. You'd have to either give huge amounts of concessions to them, either to be in exile or intervention directly, or severe economic sanctions, which would be worse than shutting down the Myanmar stock market. And so all of those seem like quite large disruptions to stability of, say, crafting a pipeline. And as we'll talk about later, right, the U.S. has said we're the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken has said, democracy intervention, that's not a thing that we do anymore. It might have been good in philosophy or in heart, but in practice, it's sucked because of, history. So we probably shouldn't do that anymore. So the U.S. is, they said they're going to do sanctions. They've done sanctions. The Fed has prevented $1 billion from the military taking it out of the country, all these things. But that's just sanctions. We've done a lot of sanctions on a lot of people that have stayed in power for a long period of time. And so
going on, I'm pretty sure as well.
So maybe like the compromise is actually China sort of helping to stabilize the new regime, and helping them transition from pure military rule into some sort of more CCP-esque sort of form of control, which someone might say, given Myanmar politics, that's really dumb to say. Fair enough. But I don't know if, in terms of China's interests, that getting rid of the coup is actually most beneficial to their goals. And so that might change sort of how the outcome comes. I know, like, aspirationally, we would love to say, like, yes, people will intervene and help the people of Myanmar and restore democracy, but that might not be in the interest of at least the most powerful stakeholders in this case.
Yeah, no, this could be an interesting opportunity. Like we said, talking again privately yesterday, for China and the U.S. to collaborate, different perspective or different incentives for collaboration. But, I think they both want to see a stable Myanmar, as I said, for different reasons. And I mean, I personally would like to see that happen. I think the key towards to solving a lot of existential issues around the world, like climate change, refugee issues, is going to be collaboration between major powers. Maybe this will help the U.S. in trying to get comfortable, engaging diplomatically more often. But yeah, we'll see. Also, something we'll be keeping an eye out for.
Yeah. And actually, just the last thing on that, which I just found interesting, is that The reason for all the democracy transitions in Myanmar in 2011 was to lessen the reliance on China and to attract foreign aid. And yet, this sort of action, it speaks to how much they really care about aid relative to power, and that they would rather sort of more so be reliant on China and keep in power than lose their degree of power or and sort of achieve their more so regional independence or relying their dependence on China, which I just thought was an interesting thing because, right, dependence on China was a factor for them to open up and become a democracy, but then ultimately that wasn't enough because they weren't fully committed to that idea, right? Ultimately, it was power that mattered the most, and so that aid money was to stay into power, seemingly, right, to fund economic growth, to say, oh, it's okay to we have only a quasi democracy. But there are also some other things in the news we wanted just to briefly touch on before we get to our final topic. Which, speaking of U.S. China working together in Myanmar, is U.S. China competition moving forward? I know you had some thoughts about that. Maybe you can start this one off.
I mean, it sort of ties into what we just talked about with Myanmar and the potential for growth, but I think the next, I'll say 2 decades, are going to be really sort of fascinating to watch in terms of competition between the U.S. and China, not just through the lens of the Thucydides trap, right? It's very commonly touted, Graham Allison, but I think, and it's a valuable theory, or way of looking at. Okay, we can talk about that as well.
Okay, the Thucydides. Let's just move on. It's going to get into a lot there. So,
I think that just the case of China in terms of economic development is going to be interesting, sort of in a vacuum, separate from the U.S. Just because China is so massive, because China has had such a troubled path of economic development in the past. You talk about the Great Leap Forward, and a lot of turbulence that came from the Cultural Revolution. Like, I just think it's going to be really interesting to see how their own story of growth sort of lines up with the U.S. story of growth. Which is, in terms of approach to the last 12 months in COVID, has been almost polar opposite, like we talked about. Granted, it's different, constituencies, different population sizes, different geographies. I just think it'll be interesting to sort of compare the two approaches of, super heavy on stimulus, rack up debt, M1 going out the, M1 like monetary supply going up, versus China, which has been a bit more conservative, and just how that pans out for each country's future in terms of growth prospects.
I think the big thing in growth prospects moving forward will be how much can China claim in fintech, and how much can China ensure that their currency at least gains a substantial hold as a reserve currency. The interesting thing about stimulus is, yes, in some way China wants to be financially prudent, but in other ways they just don't have the same capabilities that the US definitely has to the highest degree, but also the European Union, Japan, and the UK have, given that their currencies are used as sort of backup reserve currencies. The US dollar right now is about 55-60% of US reserve currencies, which is an outsized share of how big the US GDP is as a whole. The US GDP is, I think, 23% of global GDP, China 21%. And having that ratio lets the US, in theory, print out more money for stimulus. And there's a large monetary theory discussion about that, which we won't get into in this episode, but it is a tool that the US has to the highest degree. But the EU, Japan, and the UK have also had this capability, hence you've seen large stimuluses there, at least relative to the rest of the world, because the euro, for instance, is, I believe, 20-ish%, 18% of reserve currencies, which is roughly equal to their GDP. The same is true for the pound and for the yen as well. And so these countries have the capability to print stimulus and therefore drive economic growth, or in this case, sort of blunt, severe economic decline. And I think for China, they've been doing all of this massive GDP growth without having that monetary capability to also further accelerate growth. And clearly China is aware of that. That's why they push so much into fintech and to trying to be a leader in that space. And it'll be interesting to see if that transition happens, because if that does happen, I think that would be monumental in terms of where we see this U.S.-China competition gets to. And I think that's sort of the U.S. is sort of like last trump card that we still have as of right now, is that the U.S. dollar is still the reserve currency, and that we can do these sort of relatively absurd monetary tricks because of it. And I think that'll be really interesting to see how that fintech competition plays out over time.
I'm interested to think about sort of the energy futures of both countries. I know China's aiming to be, I think, carbon neutral by like 2060 or something. Between the Portugal article that we released and the Niger article that we released, we've seen that China is like the largest producer of some of the most important rare earth metals that are going to be relevant to the clean energy boom, like lithium, which is an integral, part of batteries, and uranium, which is huge for nuclear reactors, nuclear energy, clean energy, energy that is really, it's like recyclable, and it's, very low on carbon emissions. That could be a huge boon to their economic prospect moving forward. If the spot prices for those rare earth metals go up. I think the U.S. recently just opened up or is looking at doing some exploration in California to try and become self-sufficient, or in California rather, to be self-sufficient in that area, because they sort of see that the future is clean energy, and these are some of the building blocks of that movement. So if China is holding the cards there, that could be a really big win for them.
So then the U.S. should purchase Australia?
Just buy the whole country?
I mean, they have. I think they have bigger reserves than China, right? They have the biggest reserves. Am I being ignorant?
They have a lot of reserves. They're really fat reserves. They have a lot. Yeah. Maybe that means you get closer to Australia. But I think that clean energy boom is going to be really interesting. China, obviously, it's very pressing that they do something there because of just the amount of people that they have, the amount of production going on in the country. You have to have some way to do it in a clean, sustainable way. So I think they have
not only for the environment, but for people's health as well, right?
Yeah. China already, sunsets on TV because the smog is so high. Like, you need to do something, sort of mitigate the direction the country's heading in. But also, obviously, clean energy, becoming less carbon reliant is also tricky from a competition standpoint, because it's one of those things where like no country wants to be the first mover, because that's going to affect production in the short term, and then everybody else is going to be doing well while you're moving on to this, green approach to conducting business and operating.
And the costs as well, right? Being the first
it's mover. Also very expensive. Yeah. So, it takes collaboration. It takes commitment from often a group of big players. So maybe another opportunity for collaboration, either between the U.S. and China, or maybe China and India can see eye to eye because they both have large populations and both have to go green. That'll be very interesting to watch.
All right. And then I think the last topic we want to talk about today, and this is one that I think we're going to review just because once we have found this website, gone down a complete rabbit hole, it's this website called Rootclaim. Now, Andrew, you introduced me to this website. Would you like to give at least a little story about how you found this website and why you shared it with me?
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest, my roommate sent me this website, Rootclaim.com, because he knows that, we run global guessing and are interested in forecasting. And Rootclaim is sort of a perfect fit. It's similar to Metaculus in that they value crowdsourcing, to come to a consensus view on certain questions. But it also incorporates, Bayesian statistics, something that we've used and talked about in our election forecasts. And it sort of ends up being this really interesting approach to forecasting questions. So what'll happen is that you'll have a question, sort of an overarching question, and then underneath that question you'll have, various pieces of evidence related to that question. And on both the larger question and all these pieces of evidence to the question, you'll have sort of these discrete forecasts and predictions. And the topics range, way beyond geopolitics. They talk about things in pop culture. They talk about science, and a lot of content around COVID. But it's just a really interesting sort of approach to trying to figure out the answer to a question, by breaking it down into components, into different pieces, and then aggregating all of those pieces together,
So
to
I'm
get to a
sharing my
forecast.
screen right now, and we're going to start off on the Malaysian flight. I had just done a quick sort of demo if you were watching the video. It provides sort of like the background of it. How the process works is it asks the community for a series of hypotheses of what could happen. This has to do with the Malaysian Airlines flight. So they basically ask the community, well, what are different things that you thought could have happened? The first one is that the pilot deliberately crashed the flight while committing suicide. The co-pilot crashed the flight. That there was an emergency event that disrupted the flight. That the flight was hijacked. Or that it was crashed due to some sort of technical issue shortly after takeoff in the South China Sea. And then, as Andrew was saying, it sort of breaks down and it first gives initial probabilities for everything. And this is, in terms of Bayesian statistics, known as sort of like the base rate. Just given the case as it is, where does it sort of line up? And you have that. Then it sort of breaks down the evidence.
Yep.
And this is very complicated. There are all these effects, and it has to do with confidence intervals and how reliable data is. But it basically breaks down the evidence and it says how important they were to each of the different hypotheses, and then gives it a sort of like updated likelihood for, in terms of this one piece of evidence, what do you think is the most likely to come? And sort of does this for all the different pieces of evidence, multiplying or dividing by different effects. People in the community can add new pieces of evidence, question evidence. What we really like is that it breaks down evidence into super easy parts to see, right? Altitude is a piece of evidence, and there's a whole section on altitude and the different relevant factors and the different analyses, and there's sub-analyses for all of this. And this is great, we think, in terms of how it lays out evidence, how it really tries to be very specific about how does this one piece of evidence affect a hypothesis. Because I think something that we come across, Andrew, a lot with our forecasts is that we'll sort of find all the evidence and find these factors, but we don't necessarily have a clear-cut way of finalizing how these impact a final probability. And whether or not this method is the right way to weight things, it's good that they have this sort of clear weighting system that, like, why you got to this number because this had a certain confidence, this evidence had a certain reliability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It sort of
It's not
puts the
too
math
dissimilar
forward.
from our JCPOA forecast in the sense that we had all these factors, we weighted all the factors, and so you can actually go into our model and say, okay, well, what if we said that this is less important or this was more important? How does that affect the overall outcome? So no, I definitely agree. I think the approach is correct in that you're breaking things down into components and trying to build back up to some viewpoint. I do think it's not an infallible platform, right? I think there can be biases in terms of what evidence you're actually looking at, and is there evidence that wasn't voted on that could have been relevant to the story. But I think, yeah, it's not a website that I was familiar with before this week. It's really interesting to sort of go through and look at some of the different issues that they forecasted on, to sort of look at their perspective on forecasting in general. And, it might be something that we end up doing some forecasting on at some point, if they're putting out new content.
Yeah, I think one thing that we definitely should at least work on taking is this sort of numericalization of the effects. You're right, in the JCPOA we did, but we sort of said like high, low, medium. And then we did give them factors. But I think the way in which they've sort of displayed information, first of all, is, I think, really good. And just the way in which they've displayed how numerical things work is really great. Now, you had mentioned more forecasts, which is interesting because this website has kind of seemed dead. So we had done a little bit of research on LinkedIn. And the co-founder said that this project started in 2015 and ended in 2017. But there have been a lot of new forecasts on this website recently. And let's just say that I don't know if it's right or not, but Rootclaim definitely paints a different reality than I think many people have. So I'm gonna go share my screen again, and we showed off the Malaysian Airlines flight because, well, that's a pretty non-controversial result. That they say 93% chance pilot committed suicide. But let's go through the rest of the website and see what else we find. What is the source of COVID-19? 76% chance it was developed during a gain-of-function research and released by accident from the Wuhan Virology Lab. Okay. The 2013 Syrian chemical attack in Ghouta was actually a false attack carried out by the opposition forces. The same is also true for the 2017 chemical attack in Syria. 83% chance that it was carried out by the opposition. And if you go into this, and we've started to do it, but we don't want to necessarily slander these forecasts before we've done really good due diligence onto them. Yeah. But there seems to be sort of conflicting, they all talk about like we don't try to cherry pick things and stuff, but it seems like they cherry pick the weighting of numbers to sort of reach the results that they want to get. I just think it's interesting that, right, this one website has these sort of more completely out there forecasts from how sort of most people perceive events, which is not to say that it's wrong, but based on some like initial research that I have done into, say, the Syrian chemical attacks, or whether or not COVID was released from the Wuhan Virology Lab, it's not necessarily that they are wrong, but that they seem overly confident in their depiction of events. For instance, behind the COVID-19 prediction, they point out in terms of the shape of the S protein model, which is how it binds to the body or whatever. And they had pointed that out as looking as if something was derived from the lab. But other studies have come out recently that actually that sort of shape and that sort of mutation has appeared in a number of other just wild viruses in nature, and that it's actually not as much of a smoking gun, for instance, in terms of the characteristics of COVID-19, which is one of the factors they give for it being released from a lab. And so
what I mentioned about the bias of evidence, right? If you're not constantly collecting evidence and voting on it, then at some point the prediction is going to become irrelevant because it's not up to date with what's out there.
So because it's become sort of like less popular, it's been sort of, there's less alternative voices necessarily being said, and so you're only getting a sample of information being put in.
Yeah. I mean, and also who knows what else came out during that time period that the question was being actively voted on that wasn't included in the evidence underneath that initial hypothesis. Like, I think again the approach is right, but execution wise, and to no fault of their own necessarily, but I think it's just difficult to do well.
It's interesting though, they say like one of their things is that we don't cherry pick evidence is one of their steps in their process as well.
I'm sure they do a lot of work. Did a lot of work to sort of mitigate against that cherry picking or that evidence bias. Yeah, I just think it's difficult. But definitely, again, a site I'd like to keep up with. Maybe if we can get in touch with the person who created it, we can have them on at some point. That'd be really interesting. Veer's perspective and his vision for the platform, but yeah, definitely fascinating.
It's also the other thing that's interesting is that they have this track record page, and it says, so far, no hypothesis in a Rootclaim analysis that received a likelihood of 50% or more was later shown to be wrong. What's interesting in this track record is some of the things featured in the track record are still sort of unknown. They just say, like, as of right now, the balance of evidence indicates that they are correct. Which I thought was interesting, but I think the other one is, and they actually point this out, is that, as we were talking about earlier with scoring, you wouldn't actually want to have all your forecasted at over 50% chance be correct. You would actually want some of them to be correct unless they were all like 99.9% chances, which they're not. And they point this out, that they have this overperformance and that it was, quote, intentional. I don't really know how much like sort of buy that as an excuse, like, oh, we intentionally made made our model not well calibrated, and we intentionally made it miscalibrated. That seems like a sort of interesting approach to creating a forecasting model. So I don't necessarily buy that. And it's also, if you remember at Philip Tetlock's Super Forecasting, and as we talked about last week, in terms of becoming a super forecaster, you have to make at least 100 predictions before really you can say anything statistically significant about how good of a forecaster you are. And on their track record page, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 forecasts, which is a pretty small sample size to say much. Now, the difficult part is that Rootclaim says that they want to handle controversial events, and there just might not be enough controversial events, but that also then, I think, would limit how necessarily reliable you can treat the model. I don't know if, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of things with such small sample sizes, it needs more rigorous testing. So like if, whoever's running the site now were to just release a bunch more questions, just have it be a more iterative sort of experiment, we could say something more conclusive. But I agree, yeah, with such few questions, it's hard to say anything sort of determinate about the model or about the platform, aside from the fact that it's an interesting approach, another approach, in a time where it seems like a lot of people are trying to figure out how to best forecast the unquantifiable, so to speak.
Now, Andrew, I know you have a soccer game to get to. Don't want to delay you from that. So I think we will
If there
end
are
it.
any soccer fans who are watching, feel free to comment your team, your favorite team, who you watch. Love soccer. And
I
another
don't love
area where
soccer,
forecasting can be
so
relevant.
I won't read any of the comments, but Andrew will.
That's right.
This is the third episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. If you guys have any questions, topics that you want Andrew and I to talk about, please let us know. You can put it in the comments section. Reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. That would be great. If
there are any guests that you think would be good to have on, suggestions, please also feel
or if
free
you
to
want to
share.
be a guest,
Yeah, let's talk.
let's talk.
Let's talk.
And if there's anything that we talked about that you think that we should follow up on, I mean, we are going to think and talk more about the Metaculus scoring in the future, just because it's something central to forecasting that we think that we should know more about, as well as looking more into Rootclaim, because we only wanted to talk a lot about the surface level things that we feel confident about. As we alluded to, there's a lot more underneath the surface to get to on Rootclaim, but that will have to wait until we feel really confident to talk about it, because we have our own website. We know how much time and effort. I mean, just looking at this, a lot of time and effort went into this. You don't want to really say, you want to say the nice things until you can necessarily say more about the rest. So we'll just leave it at that. Anything else, Andrew?
No, just looking forward to next week and hearing people's feedback. So yeah, this has been great.
All right. And that is the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, episode 3. Thanks, everyone.